Hello everyone. In today's lab, I'm going to show you how to create a 3D model from your concept art that you imported into Maya as image planes. So you have your reference material already imported, continuing from the previous lab. And from here, we are going to go ahead and I'm going to show you a couple different things. I'm going to show you how to box model this straight through. I'll also show you how to create this using the attribute editor, and then a couple other things. I'll show you some it's called wireframe on shaded and x-ray mode in your viewport. We're going to use that in our front orthographic viewport, so this way while you're modeling you can actually see through x-ray through to your reference material. And the other thing I kind of want to touch base on, and I find this to probably be one of the more important parts of this particular lab without getting into the actual physical modeling of it and the techniques that we're going to use, is how to break down a model, whatever it might be. If it's a chair, if it's a house, if it's a, I don't know, a sofa, a bed, whatever. How do you break that down into different pieces that make it easier for you to model and make the most of your time and the most accurate? So looking at this sword, for example, I'm going to break this down into 4 parts. So I see the blade as being 1 part. You could even say maybe 5, because this top part is a little triangle looking piece. And then you have your blade here, which is a long rectangle, right? And then you have these 2 little shapes here. I mean, you could break this down into many, many pieces, but we're going to do it in 4. And we're going to start to block out this sword. And that's what this lab really is. We're just blocking out a model before we get into more intricate details in terms of making it what modelers would call airtight or watertight, when we start to merge it all into one piece. So what they mean by that is that no air could get in or anything like that. But today we're going to break it down into 4 parts, okay? And start this model. So what I'll do is I'm just going to get right into it. I'm in my front orthographic viewport. I'm just tapping on my space bar with my mouse hovered over, right? That's how you do that. You can't just tap space bar and have it. It's always going to go to the one which one your mouse is hovered over. So in my front orthographic viewport, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a cube. And the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I can actually see through this, so I can see my reference material here. And in order to do that, I need to change some settings. So in my front orthographic viewport, I'm going to go to shading, and I'm going to turn on X-ray. And now I can actually see through the model. But one thing I like to have on is I like to be able to see, especially because it is transparent, if I click on this, it's the only time I can actually see the edges of the model, right? I want to be able to see that even when I am deselected from it. So I'm going to go again up here to shading, and I'm going to turn on wireframe on shaded, and a keyboard shortcut Alt and 5, so Alt plus 5. So now you'll see that even though I'm deselected from it, I can still see this dark blue border of the edges of my model. Now that's a great start. So now I can see through it using my X-ray mode, and I can also see the edges of where clearly defined where they are on the exterior of the model. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on this cube, and another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename it right off the bat to sword blade mesh, and enter. And now I've got it named. I can see through it, and I can see the edges even if I'm deselected. I can sort of see the skeleton of it, if you will, while I'm not selected on it. And now I can now I'm kind of ready. That's like my prep work before I get into the heavy duty lifting of modeling this. So very, very basic in terms of how we're going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and scale this and move it. And I'm just going to bring it to the bottom of this triangle, and I'll show you why in a moment. And I'm going to make this pretty easy, 1.7, just so everyone can follow along pretty well, and I'll make this 8.5. So they're easy numbers to work with. So I translated it 1.7, and I scaled it 8.5. Okay. I feel like that's an okay size. Maybe I should thin it down a little bit. Let's make it 0.8 on X. So here's the numbers that I'm working with. 1.7 on translate Y, scale X is 0.8, and scale Y is 8.5. So this way you can all get started exactly how my model is. Now the next thing I would like to do is, because I'm going to use the attribute editor first on this model, I'm going to click on my attribute editor. I'm going to go to my polycube, and then I'm going to also go to my subdivisions in width, and I'm going to make this 2. So now you can see, let me switch to this view. You can see that I've got that edge down the middle. And let's do this. Wireframe unshaded. So this way you can actually see it as I'm building. So here I've got my width, subdivisions on my width at 2. And remember, you can only do this effectively when before you do any modifications to the model. Don't move any edges, faces, or verts, and don't extrude any faces, edges, or verts. Stick to it like this. Now, with that being said, I'm going to also adjust my height, and I don't need to do this. I do it for aesthetic reasons. I think I'm going to switch to 8. I think it's sort of important to have some topology in here. If I wanted to make this exact, I could start pulling edges and verts and make everything look perfect along my outline. But I'm not going to do that. And the only reason I'm showing you this with these subdivisions is just so you kind of get used to it. But I don't need it that much or at all if I was going super low poly. But that's not always the case. So anyway, I want you to just get used to it. The next thing I really kind of overlooked before I got this far is I need to scale it in. But that won't mess up any of my polycube history here with my subdivisions, because I haven't actually modified the model's attributes in any way, at least inside of Maya's thinking cap, right? So I can go ahead and just scale this in, and I want to make it pretty thin because it's a sword. So let's go something like that, and I want to do this at one too many. There we go. And my subdivisions in depth is going to be 2. Going back to my channel box editor because I want everything to be able to follow along. Let's make it 1.5. Oh, 0.15. There we go. So you can have all the same exact settings as mine. And then in here, 2, 8, and 2 under width, height, and depth of subdivisions. So with that being said, I now have the blocking phase of my sword. I'd say it's pretty good. I only have one more thing to do. So I'm going to select my sword. I'm going to hold right click, and I'm going to shuffle over to holding right click to vertex. Again, I'm going to click my model, hold right click, and go to vertex. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to grab that point right in the middle, and I'm going to press W for my move tool, and I'm actually going to switch my camera viewport now because I only have that one vertex selected, or vertex selected, and I'm going to go ahead and click and drag it up with my move tool to about the tip of the blade. So now I've got the works of a sword. Now, another thing I want to do, because this is still a rectangle, is I want to pull in these edges in order to make it look like it's actually sharp. And a really fast and easy way, like I showed you before on the bookcase, is instead of, and I'm going to start with these outer edges, all four corners of the edges, I'm going to select around, holding shift instead of clicking each one individually. And you always want to make sure you don't accidentally select like this one, because then it's going to be all weird and stuff, right? What we're going to do is we're going to undo that. The fastest and easiest way to do it, and I think it's the easiest way to follow along, is just hover over it. You'll see it highlights in a dark, bold red line. Double click it, and that'll select that entire edge loop. And hold shift and double click this one, and then rotate around and hold shift and double click this one, and hold shift and double click this one. So now I've got all of the edges around my sword selected, and all I did is double click, hold shift, double click, rotate around, double click, holding shift, double click, holding shift, and now I've got my edges, right? So I'm not going to move these around because it's going to move them all wonky, right? I want it to look somewhat symmetrical. It is a sword. I know this isn't perfectly symmetrical, but we're going to just make it easy to work with. Instead of doing it that way, I'm going to tap R on my keyboard for my scale tool. Your scale tool can also be found right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale these in to give it the appearance of sort of that sharp edge to it, right? So now I've got those image planes in the way. I've got that sharp edge, right? And I'd probably mention this, but typically I would have these hidden, looking through all camera views, because as you noticed before, I'm like rotating around and I can't see this side of my sword and blah, 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 blah. So I can just do looking through camera on the side, and now it's just the blade itself in here. All right. So we've got this far. What's next? So we're going to go down here to our front camera view, and we are going to create another cube, and we're going to start the blocking process of this hilt, if you will, or hand guard. I like hand guard because it guards your hand, but whatever. I think it's called a hilt officially. I could be wrong. And I'm just going to start to scale this into place. Let's make this -3. No, that's too much. -2.9. That'll work. And then I'm going to also scale this outward. And because I'm using my attribute editor for this, I'm going to go all the way to the edges. Right? Now that I'm all the way to the edges, what I can do is, and what are we at? 4.6. And let's make this, let's see, 0.7. I don't know. That should work. And now that I've got my translate, my scale, X, Y, and Z, I want to scale it on my last axis, on the Z axis, which I can really only access by switching my viewport by tapping spacebar. And you can always do, go into these viewports over here and then kind of mess around. If it gets, because it's really early, if it gets too soon for you, you can stay like modeling like this. I used to do it all the time and just model in with all four view ports open. But I'm going to jump into the larger viewport so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. So now the last thing I'm going to do with this is I'm just going to sort of scale this in. Let's make it 0.5. That'll work. So I've got my sword here. And the last thing I'm going to do, maybe I'm not the last thing. I just caught myself. I need to name this. So we're going to call this sword hilt. I think it's called a hilt mesh. And now the last thing I'm going to do in terms of playing around in my channel box and my attribute editors, go to my Polycube 2. But you'll also notice here that I have everything named. I can easily select anything I wanted right here in my outliner. So I love to have the outliner open. Also make sure you don't have extra objects in your scene that you didn't even know you had. It will happen, I promise. And then anyway, so back in here, we'll get to our subdivisions in width, and I'm going to bring this out to 8. So what it looks like here, you can see it's got one directly down the middle. Let's see. Yeah, that should work. Yep, that'll work. And then so it looks just like this. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, well, I keep saying last thing because it's not the last thing. I'm going to start to manipulate this object here to make it match my reference. So I'm going to focus on the right side for this one because it matches more closely over here than it does here because it's not perfectly symmetrical. And there's so many different ways you could do this. There's no right or wrong way, but I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest. I personally like to work in this view, hold right click, go to my vertex, and make sure you do a click and drag. If you do not, you're only going to select one of these and you'll see that it's still the other ones behind it. If you do a click and drag, you'll select both vertices, the one in the front and the back, and I'm going to do that on both sides because I like to work in one viewport primarily, but I'll show you. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag that down, and I'm going to do the same thing, holding shift, select both of these and drag that down, and I'm going to do the same thing over here on the last one and drag that down. And I think personally that's the easiest way to do it. Now if I undo this, another way you could do this with less selections is hold right click and go to your edge and select the corresponding ones and just click and drag them down. There is no right or wrong way to do it. And just like so. And you'll see that it matches my reference pretty closely. Like I said, this doesn't need to be perfect. We're just sort of blocking out our model, okay? So now we've got some geometry. We've got more than enough to work with. We've got the sword starting to take shape, and we're starting this block out process. Now, for the handle, we're going to be working with a cylinder. So this is the first time we're actually selecting a different shape. And this is where the attribute editor really comes in handy when you're working with like the polycylinder, for example. When you click it, by default, it makes it a perfect circle, or as best as it possibly can, because it does have all these edges, right? But it's a perfect circle basically, or cylinder. And there's a lot of geometry there. There's too much to work with, in my personal opinion. And it is too much to work with. You can always add more. It's easier to add subdivisions later than it is to work with early on. And a really common habit and practice, I guess, of newer learning 3D modelers is that they start to get hung up on the little details too early on, and you find yourself focusing on one very small, minuscule aspect of your model because you're working with so much geometry that it just seems like it's so overwhelming because you're working with so much more than you need to. but it looks cooler and easier in your 3D world realm here. But it's not. It definitely, take my advice, work with less topology first, and you can add more later. It's easier to add it later than it is to work with it early on, because it's just very, very, it can be very time consuming and headache, and it's just not an efficient way to do it. So on this model, I'm going to switch this to 8 on my subdivisions axes in my attribute editor. So it starts originally at 20, select my model, go to my polycylinder tab, go to my subdivision axes, and switch it to 8. And now I've got the start of my shape. So this is 8. This is 8 subdivisions in height. This is 8 subdivisions in width, and this is 8 subdivisions in axes. And we can add more, which we're going to be. But now that I've got it to this point, I'm going to tap R on my keyboard and scale this in. Okay, and I used another common mistake is that, especially when working in these, you might accidentally scale it like this, and you'll see what happens. It becomes this really elongated handle. You need to make sure you grab it from the center. That center scale tool to make it scale uniformly. And the next thing I'll do is I'm going to scale it to length. And that's perfect. And now that I've got that, I can start to add a little bit more geometry to the height. And in this case, I'm going to do 4. I don't want to get too crazy. I think 4 is a good place to start this. And now what I can do is I can start to sort of shape this into my handle that has this subtle curve. And I'm going to just pick one side. I don't know which one yet. I'm going to hold right click and go to my edge mode. And you can just double click the top edge. You have to make sure you double click it. And this part I'm going to scale inward. And you can see it happening up here, how it's scaling inward as well. This is pretty good, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm scaling it from the center tool to just sort of match. I guess I'm following the left line because it's just already kind of on there. And then I'm going to scale this one in. And I'm going to double click the last one and scale this one in using my center tool. And now I've got this blocked out handle, right? And let's check my channel box. So let's make this -4.5. Yep. And let's just make it 0.27. And let's make that 1.3 and 0.27. And now it's just so you can see, it's easier for you to look at instead of hopefully pausing and double checking all these numbers. They don't have, this is just to have you follow along with me if you want it to look as identical to mine. I know that's yours doesn't have to look identical to mine, just so you know. One last thing, actually, coming back to this hilt, I want to add a little bit more geometry, and since I really haven't done too much, I hope this works without me messing anything up, and it does. And you'll see, I've been preaching this the whole time. I was hoping it didn't, but this is going to happen to you too if you forget, which I did, is that I wanted to add an edge loop down here in the middle, and we're going to cover that one in the next lab. So anyway, well, I could show you how to do it right now. Let's go ahead and hover over this multi-cut tool. I'm going to hold Control and Shift, and you'll see it's at 50%, and now I've just added an extra row of geometry. So that's a foreshadowing into future labs here. So the other thing I'm going to do is last part of this shape is going to be a sphere. And in my sphere here, created it again, going to the polysphere tab. We're getting into habits of things, right? We can adjust this to 8, and we're going to adjust this to 8 so I don't have a million polygons. Just to show you really quickly, display, heads up display, I think it's in here, poly count. So the second row is what I have selected. The first row is what I have in my scene. I know some of you are gamers and things like that. So I have, in terms of triangles, tries, that's what gaming engines typically run off of. This sphere alone is 760 triangles just to make up this. It has 400 faces as it currently sits. Edges, it has 780 edges, and on vertices 382, and that's a lot of geometry to start to work with. So going back to my polysphere in the editor, 8, 8, and now you're going to see those numbers divide significantly. Verts is now at 58, edges at 120, faces 64, in compared to, what was it, 400 or something, and tries down to 112 from 760, if I remember right. And UVs we're going to get into later. Anyway, I don't want you to focus on poly count, but I do want to show you the difference between 8 subdivisions and 20 subdivisions. So now I've got this sphere, and I want to go ahead and just bring this down. This is probably going to be the easiest part of this whole model. Zoom in, and let's bring it down. And let's bring it a little bit bigger. I'm going to kind of line up this. What I want to do, this is my goal here, is I want to line this up. You see that final edge right here? I want to line that up with the bottom. So later on I don't have as much work to do. So switching in here. Right there. That's where I want it. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not concerned about the shape or precision, if you will. I just want it to look accurate, right? I want it to look like a sword, and I think this is really, really beginning to start to reference from our model here. So if you didn't add this, I'll show this one more time. I didn't want to get into it. I wanted to add it in the attribute editor, but I forgot. But I held Control and Delete to do that really quickly. If I just highlight this, because this is probably going to happen to you, and I hit Delete, it keeps the vertex information in there, which is not good. Because it's just, you don't need them there. There's no edges connected to them, and it's just making Maya think too hard to keep everything together, so it can really mess you up. But if you double click this and hold Control and Delete, it's going to delete the vertices as well as the edge. So if you're later on want to try to introduce this early so you start to remember it and practice it later, holding Control when deleting things is going to delete other things associated to it, in this case the vertices, which is a big help. How annoying would it be to go ahead and delete this edge and then have to go in and delete every vertice as well, right? Just a whole lot of work, unnecessary work. Just hold Control and Delete. And I just want to show this one more time before I jump into a little box modeling. So I have my object selected, if I hover over it, multi-cut tool, and in the modeling toolcut, I believe it's in here too, multi-cut tool. Click on that, hold Control so it creates a full edge loop, and hold Shift to snap it every 10%. So in this case we want it to be dead center. We're going to bring it to 50%. Just want to move my crosshair out of the way there. So you'll see it's 50%, and it's previewing basically with that orange line what it'll be, and then you just left click, and now I've just created a clean, perfect edge loop right around that hilt. So that is the sword blocking phase, and let me make sure I've got everything named, which I don't think I do. Sword handle mesh, and here sword sphere. I don't know what to call that part. Let's call it sword bottom sphere mesh. And I'm going to make these just so you could take a look at it. Here's my sword blade mesh, my translate, or my channel box information, I'll call it, in case you wanted to pause it and make sure yours is the same. It doesn't need to be perfect or 100% identical to mine. I promise you I wouldn't decrease any grading if yours didn't look exactly like mine, so don't worry about that. But in case you wanted to take a final look through, I'm going to go over these on the channel box information if you wanted to pause it, the video real quick, just to make sure your numbers matched. I hope it's big enough to see. I think it will be, as long as you, yeah, it'll be fine. Handle is -4.5, 2.27, 1.3, 0.27 on XYZ, blah, 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 blah. So you can use this information, and then in your attribute editor, I'll run over this and show you. Just keep an eye on the subdivisions here. On the sphere, it's 8 and 8. On the polycylinder, which is the handle, it's 8, 4, and 1. On the hilt, now I've got extra ones. I gotta find my polycube 2. So all of this information in here, since I did some deleting and I started playing around with the model to show you some quick little tips and tricks, it keeps all that information in there. And trust me when I say this, when you get into a complex modeling scene, you're going to want to remember how to delete the history. You don't have to worry about it yet. I'll show you that. It's not difficult at all to do, but this way you can actually go back and see what you did. But we're going to go to polycube. Not that one. Yeah. Polycube subdivision width, height, and depth is 8, 1, and 1. And then the width, height, and depth on this one, on the blade, is 2, 8, and 2. So here is the blocked out model of our sword. And let's turn the grid off for a second. Highlight all these. I'm tapping F on my keyboard to snap to the center. And now you can see, without the grid in the way, our little 3D model. That's one of the orthographic cameras, I believe. Yep, that's your side camera I just selected. If you see that, that's your front. But anyway, so there is your blocked out sword utilizing the attribute editor. I'm going to start a new video, a second video, to go over how to do this using the we're blocking out the model, the box modeling, the box modeling technique. And one last thing, actually, before I jump into the next one, if you wanted to utilize the side viewport, I'm totally fine with everything that's in here just as it is for your labs. If you wanted to challenge yourself, you could actually go ahead and model another one, so you'll have two of these basically side by side if you wanted to get challenging. But realistically, I would do that in a separate file, or save it out as this is the done complete one, and then, you know, sword Maya file complete, and then you could do sword using the same one. Just make sure you save it under a different name, and to save file, save scene as. There's also so anyway, one last thing. I'm getting distracted here. To do the ring, if you wanted to challenge yourself, I said I would show you that. So we're going to start with the polygon torus, and it's basically a donut. And I'm rotating it on x-axis at 90 degrees. It's the first time we've rotated something, so E on your keyboard is rotate, or this button right here. And now I'm going to go ahead and drag this down, and I'm going to scale this into place. And the other thing I'm going to do, you guessed it, the attribute editor, right? Polytorus, we're going to change this to 8, and we're going to change the next one to 8. And now I've got the shape. Now, let me see here. No, that's not the one. It's playing around. Oh. So, which one is it? I think there's a way to... Very, very sensitive. If I wanted to, using my mouse, it's just too sensitive. It jumps too far. So on my section radius, 0.3. Let's try 0.4. Let's go 0.3, and let's try just to see what this does, because this was kind of jumpy. 1.1 on my radius. 1.2. I'd say something like that might probably work. If you wanted to get tricky, you could create a little ring here. You can also do other cool little things with this. Twist. Kind of twists it around. I don't know. Let's see exactly what it's doing. Oh yeah, look at that. That's a cool little, could be really useful for a cool little animation of some sort. Anyway, that's the ring if you wanted to do that. If you wanted to create a little ring in there. But either or, I'm going to delete that. We're going to stick with the sphere. It's just easier to work with. But you could do the ring if you wanted to challenge yourself. Or if you wanted to challenge yourself and go ahead and create the other part here. But you wouldn't make the side viewport have it just as thick, because then it would just be right back to like a rectangular square. We want to keep that blade thin so it looks sharp on the edges. Other than that, I'm going to end this video, and then I'm going to have another one for you in the same canvas shell on the modules for this lab. I'll do one using a box modeling technique. And again, if you have any questions for your submission, I just want you to go ahead. You could submit a screenshot of this. Actually, you know what? I want to make sure. No, submit a screenshot of. Just gonna center all these. Just send a screenshot that has your front, your side, and your perspective orthographic. I'm not too concerned about the top because we don't have a reference image to validate the top from. But send a screenshot of this. This will be more than acceptable, perfectly fine. So I can see what your model looks like in terms of the reference images in comparison, and the geometry and the shapes and everything. If you want, you can. I want you to definitely submit the screenshot. You can also submit your Maya file if you like, but definitely submit the screenshot. If you were struggling with it and it doesn't look just right, submit your Maya file as well. I already have the concept art for the image for this, so you don't have to worry about sending that as well in an upload. But in future projects where we have texturing and things like that, just keep in mind you're going to need to submit your texture files. But other than that, that's all I've got for you on this one. But this more than is more than enough for the lab submission. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to assist you. The fastest way to contact me and for the quickest response is through Canvas inbox. And other than that, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope I answered all your questions. But yeah, shoot me a message if there's anything you're struggling with. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video.